Good morning, everybody. Hope you had a fun time on the wild streets of Geneva. Today, we're starting with Nicolas Mestre, who is a macroeconomist in the division of globalization here at Unctad.
Thank you, Jerry, for this introduction, and good morning, everybody. I'm really delighted to be with you this morning to discuss about trade-related issues. And I think to kick off, this day, I thought it would be interesting to provide you with a kind of summary or, let's say, a mapping of world trade, and to discuss mostly what has happened over the last 30, 40 years. So, as you know, the backlash against hyperglobalization has recently gained momentum, and the international trading system has been put on the front line. There is increasing discontent in the north, which has added to numerous and long-standing concerns that developing countries have been raising about the working of international trading system for decades. And in addition, the new protectionist tide, together with the declining spirit of international cooperation, poses significant challenges for governments around the world, as it risks creating a vicious circle of retaliatory action, heightened economic uncertainty, and slower growth. So, as I hope you will agree after my presentation this morning, and especially and more generally about this entire week, the solution is not really to push for a world of untrammeled free trade, but rather recognizing that resisting isolationism effectively requires recognizing that many of the rules adopted to promote the allegedly free trade have failed to move the system in a more inclusive, participatory, and development-friendly direction. So, in short, to already give you a kind of conclusion to my talk today, reviving optimism about trade and multilateralism must go beyond simply promoting trade for trade's sake. So I will come back to that, obviously, at the end of my presentation. This is very briefly, the outline of what I would like to discuss with you today. So first, I will review with you some stylized facts on the shifting dynamics of world trade systems since the Second World War, highlighting some key patterns that have shaped this changing landscape. So mostly I will try to address the three following questions. To what extent has trade promoted structural change in developing countries? Second, which country and or social groups have benefited from deeper trade integrations? And lastly, under what condition can trade have a positive developmental and distributive effect? So answering those three questions is a necessary steps towards discussing the related macroeconomic risk and for sketching also appropriate policy recommendation. So let me now start with a long-term view by looking at the average annual growth of economic output and trade after the Second World War by looking at various periods. So as you can see from this chart, and by the way, this presentation draws mostly from the TDR 2008, Chapter 2. So if you can't see 2018, so if you can't see very well some of the figure, you have all of them in the report that is also available on the table there. So coming back now to the trade dynamics after the Second World War. So what we can see is that between 1950 and 1973, world trade grew at nearly 8%. So that's these bits here in red. And and that was something that wasn't somehow registered before. So that was mostly due, to a decline of trade cost of all kinds. There was the peace dividends. There was improvement in transport, partly linked to containerization. There was a fast pace of investment and a rapid productivity growth. There was also a measured drop in tariff. And finally, there was a stable international monetary system. So, as you may know, most of the increase in trade flows reflected rising intra and inter trade among developed countries, together also with a strong regional dimension in some part of the developing world. And what you can also see from this chart is that developed country, and that's the part here, the darker part, which gives you the contribution of developed country to those annual growth figure, accounted for basically 2/3 of the growth of world trade during this period. In the south, basically, growth rate of output and trade during what we call here the golden age were consistently higher than in previous period, but also lower than in advanced economy. Another way to look at the trade dynamic is to focus on export elasticity of economic output, and that's basically what you have in this figure. And what we can see is that during the golden age, again, trade played a significant role as it grew faster than global and regional economic output. And that was a kind of echo of what happened before World War I, where also we have elasticities significantly above 1. Now, despite this strong dynamism, the structure of trade has remained highly unbalanced. As I said before, developing country trade was dominated by primary export to northern market, which on average, still accounted for 2/3 of developing countries' export. And that was toward the end of the golden age. So if one look, for instance, at seaborne trade, which is the main vector for shipping goods in the world, data show that in 1970, almost 2/3 of the world tonnage were loaded in, i.e., exported from a developing country, whereas only, 1/5 was unloaded there, so meaning imported in developing country. So this gap, contrasts with developing countries' export and import, which when we measure them in nominal terms, so in dollar, they were roughly equivalent. So in our view, this difference is a reminder of the unfavorable terms of trade and the balance of payment constraint that prevailed during that era. And that basically also constrained developing country as a provider of primary commodities. This idea also underpin what the idea. This data, also underpin the idea of an unequal exchange, which argued that the structure of world trade was responsible for the persistent inequality between developed and developing countries. And as I'm sure it was addressed already yesterday during one of the lectures, the worry is that developing countries will remain marginalized and unable to take advantage of international trade, provided the basis for the creation of Unctad in 1964. So the aim of developing countries at the time was to renegotiate trade rule so as to loosen the constraint on catch-up growth and to redirect international cooperation in support of the diversification away from commodity dependence. Unfortunately, developing country concern did not disappear afterwards. Rather, on the contrary, if you look at the period from 1973 to 1986, what you can see from this slide is that this period was quite difficult for advanced and developing countries alike, except maybe for oil exporters who enjoyed significant terms of trade gain. That was also the time of the Volcker shocks, the debt crisis. So this period was rather a strong slowdown in terms of economic dynamism. And to be more exhaustive, one should add that there was also, some positive sign coming from some of the export-oriented growth model in the East Asian, so-called newly industrial economies, which started to show in the late 1960s. And that accelerated afterwards. Yet, what we can see from this chart, it's also that the annual gross trade more than half in 1973 and 1986 period compared to the previous one. And meanwhile, the annual growth of global output decreased from 5 to 3%. So that's the figure here in blue. Also, during this period, the South contributed a little over 1/10 of global trade expansion, so relatively, little, and about 1/3 of the growth of world income. Okay, starting from the mid-1980s, there was a new phase of trade expansion which took place, and that contrasts significantly with the two previous post-war periods that we have here on this chart. And there was really, a strong acceleration of trade, where also, the developing world played a significant role. So if you look at the two periods here, 1986, 1988, and the next one until the global financial crisis, what you can see is that the growth of world trade in real terms was more than 6%. And the contribution of the South was about half that figure. Also, if we look at trade elasticities, what we can see is that they were significantly above 1. They even reached 2.4 during the 1986-1998 period, which is a sign that there was really, a strong globalization taking place. But at the same time, what you can also observe, from this figure here, is that the growth of world output still remains significantly below what we observed during the Golden Age. So here we are at about 3-4% compared to the figure above 5 that we have before. How much time do I have? Yeah. Okay. Because I planned for 1 hour and I was informed that I have 40 minutes, so I'm squeezing a little bit my presentation. Anyway, so that's in our view, it reflects, the shift, this decrease in the growth of global output, reflect the shift that we have in the broad macroeconomic policy framework that led, to higher unemployment, lower investment in developed countries, and thus lower growth. And we'll probably come back to that during this week. So again, if we look at the aggregate figure here, the picture seems rather positive from a developing country, at least compared to what we had in the past. Yet, the reality is much more nuanced. So now I will focus a little bit more on the period that starts in the mid-1980s. And I will describe, more what happened for the developing world. So if we look at the evolution of world trade over the last 3 decades, we show that there was a strong trade acceleration, and that was particularly the case in East and Southeast Asia, with mutually reinforcing dynamic interaction between profit, investment, and export in state-targeted industrial sector. And this happened mostly in what we call the first tier of newly industrialized economies, so in East Asia, and also later on in China. So if one look here at the evolution of total gross export in the world, what you can see here is the increased share of newly industrialized country over time, particularly, let's say, from the mid-70s, and which is about now 10% of world trade. And also later on, from the early 90s, let's say, the rise of China, which now represent about 13% of total export. At the same time, so this increasing share was mostly based on the decreasing share of developed economy. But what you can also observe from these figures is basically for the rest of the world, except maybe here during the commodity super cycle, there was no really, an increase in their share in total trade. And also, what we will see mostly in these figures, so I'm not sure how easy it is to read it from where you are, but this figure, contains a lot of information, so let me spend a little bit of time to explain you how it works. So we have, so basically that depict, the structure of world trade in the world economy, and you have the node for each group, and the size of that node, basically represent how large is the trade flows in for that particular group, and the edge width also depicts the bilateral trade that one region has with the rest of with the other group. Also, one important thing is that you have various color for the edge. So if it goes towards the blue, that means that your trade is mostly based on manufacture, while if it's in the red or in the orange, it means that on aggregate, your trade is mostly based on primary commodities. And finally, the direction of edges is clockwise, meaning that when you see here this edge from Advanced Asia to Europe, that means the export from Advanced Asia to Europe. And in 1986, you can't really see an edge going to Europe to Advanced Asia because the European trade towards that region was less than 5%, and therefore it was not represented on that chart. So, coming back to now what you can observe in this figure. So in 1986, what we observed is that there was rather, limited trade flows outside the developed world. At the time, developing countries mostly provided raw material and energy sources to developed economy. In 1996, there was an increased role played by the most advanced economies in Asia, which was already evident, and also a shift away from commodity-based export for this group. 10 years later, so in 2006, the significant change was an increased significance of China, and also a very strong intra-European trade. At the time, that was also the period during which, China overtook Japan as the largest exporter in Asia. And in 2007, China became the world's largest exporter in the world. Finally, by 2016, China registered an even greater share in the world export, together with other advanced Asian economy. But beyond, let's say, this rise of the South-South trade, what this figure also shows is the restructuring of the Asian pole in global trade. And I'm sure, my colleague, Pier Giuseppe Fortunato, will come back to that in the third session this morning. So what we can also draw, from that figure is that apart from some successful cases in Asia, there has been very little evidence of broad-based trade-induced structural change in other parts of the developing world. And rather, hyper-specialization has in fact accompanied the acceleration of trade from the 1990s, including with the rise of South-South trade. So this in part reflects the reversion in many developing countries to primary export dependence against the backdrop of rising commodity prices from the start of the millennium. But it's also, a reflection of the asymmetric power relation between lead firm and supplier in manufacturing value chain and weak bargaining position for developing countries. Okay. Okay. Obviously, if you look at 20 minutes, okay, that should do. If you look at what I've provided so far, which are the gross export figure, looking at those figures can be misleading because, especially in a world where global value chain is really important, in fact, what you observe as export, as a sign of, let's say, the development process of some country, can in fact be imported. So for this reason, there has been what we call the trade in value-added data that have been developed by various organizations. And if we look at those trade in value-added data, the picture we observe is slightly different, and maybe the conclusion we can draw are less favorable to developing countries. So here in that figure, what we have represented is the trade in value added. So the blue line here is the evolution of the total value of trade in value added for developed country and developing country on that chart. And you also have, here the share that are split between services, manufacturing, and agriculture. So what we would like to emphasize is that, first of all, if we look at the total value in value added of trade, developed countries still remain, significantly higher than the developing world. And also, if we remove, slowly, let's say, the contribution of China, the newly industrialized country, and also the contribution of commodities, what remains here is the green line. And as you can see, it doesn't increase that much in developing country over that period. Okay. That kind of conclusion can also be drawn if one look at the country level. So there, I'm sure you can't see anything on the screen, so I apologize for that. But you have the table in the Trade and Development Report, and basically what we look at in this table is to see how basically the value-added share in gross export have changed for developing country over time. And one thing that is really interesting is in that table is that really, China appears really as an outlier in that table, in the sense that it was one of the few countries that has managed to increase their share in manufacturing domestic value added in gross export. So you have the number somewhere here. So basically, between 1995 and 2014, China managed to increase its value-added share in gross export in manufacturing by 12 percentage points. So that's really significant. And one thing that you can also notice that for the rest of the developing world, they mostly have, negative number here for the manufacturing column, meaning that sector has somehow decreased, but at least in relative term. And what you observe here is that mostly when there was some increase, it was due to the higher share or the higher contribution of agriculture and especially extractive industry. Yes? This one?
Could you put the microphone on?
On this table, Turkey has actually a very negative number for the, development for the services sector, trade and value added. Does it include banking sector? Is that an explanation for this kind of negative development?
So I'm not really in a position to comment right now on all those specific details, but we can discuss that, either later or I can provide you, with the data and we can come back to that.
Thank you very
much. Okay. So, 15 minutes. Okay. So far, I have mostly, described the development of world trade in a rather, aggregated manner. If you are interested in that particular topic, there are also two interesting figures in the report. The figure 2.8 and 2.9 that you can also look at that basically describe, the technology intensity of export of various developing groups and how they have evolved either bilaterally, or in aggregate. But for the rest of my presentation this morning, I would like now to shift to the trade-related, let's say, evolution in income distribution. And for that, fortunately, for us, there was some recent development in terms of data that has allowed, to shed light on trade in income distribution following the global fragmentation of production. And in this context, in particular, De Vries and his co-authors have examined, how the value added is distributed across capital and labor, sometimes even by splitting labor within two business functions, headquarter function, which is a proxy for high-skilled labor, and also fabrication, which is more a proxy for low-skilled and medium-skilled workers. So their data, show that changes in factor income shares in global manufacturing, global value chain, mostly benefited the owners of capital in the north as well as in the south. And this challenges a key prediction of the shareholding model that underpins the narrative of global value chain as a vehicle for reducing inequality in the south. So more precisely, the data from the World Input-Output database that they have somehow used and even construct suggests that the reshaping of global manufacturing production and trade, increase in inequality in both, the developed and the developing countries. So at the global level, which is here basically the first row, what we observe is that the share of capital income in manufacturing global value chain increased by 3 percentage points between 2000 and 2014. Meanwhile, what we observe is that the income share accruing to workers in the fabrication stage, which again is a good proxy for low and medium skilled labor, declined by 3.7 percentage points in high-income countries and 1.3 percentage points in most of the G20 emerging economies, but China. So here, basically, we can see that for the worker involved in the fabrication process, their labor share has basically decreased, strongly in high-income countries, but also in other developing countries. The only place where we have, at least in the data, a significant increase in the labor share is in China, If we look at other G20 emerging economies, sometimes we can see that the labor share increased in some countries like Brazil, Indonesia, and the Russian Federation. But this was mostly due to a larger, let's say, labor income share accruing to a worker in headquarter function, so high-skilled worker, and not really the fabrication function, because that was always negative. So that's a strong sign that somehow the manufacturing global value chain has basically increased inequality in most of the country, and in a sense that's, in our view, partly due to the strong concentration that we observe in export market, and the fact that you have some superstar firm or some leading firms that are making a lot of profit, and I will come back to that in a second. So, as I said, one key element behind the income polarization in manufacturing is the very high concentration in export market. Now, in this chart, we use data from the export dynamic database from the World Bank, which basically shows the evolution of the average share of top 1%, top 5%, and top 25% exporter within one country. So as you can see, from that chart, between 1997 and 2014, the top 1% exporter in all countries, on average, now export about 57% of total export of that country on average. Okay, so it's really, a few firms who export a lot. If you now look at the top 5% firm on average for all the country, on average, they export about 80% of one country total export. If we look at the top 25% of the top 25% firm in one country, they export on average almost 100% of the export of that particular country, and that's something that's a feature that is not based only on developed country or something like that. You can, in developed country, for instance, it's more or less, the same process. That's something that really it's happening everywhere. And what you can also see is that there is a tendency for that shares to rise, especially for the top 1%. Okay, so in a sense, that reflects the monopolistic behavior of large firms, which sometimes harm the potential for inclusive development, and that's also reflect corporate trends that somehow those firms gain. And unfortunately, this database is not doesn't have lots of information about profit and all that. It mostly report the total export and all that. So for what we try to do next, it's to use another database that has been developed in Unctad by a colleague, Rashid Bouya, who will present his work tomorrow when he will discuss the rentier or the corporate rentierism. And what we have done here is to look at the top 2,000 TNC in the world. So there's some drawback with this methodology, because we can't really split between what we observe for the revenue of those firms is not only based on trade, because they have some domestic activities, but still, if you look at their revenue, it's somehow Obviously, it's higher than world trade because some of the revenue comes from domestic activities, but it matched pretty much the evolution of world trade over time. And that's not really so surprising because we know from the previous figure here that the largest firm, let's say, are the ones who really trade. And the advantages of using that database is that we can look at the net sales or revenue and also the profit and all that. And what we can see is that for those firms over time, the total profit has basically increased, or even some ratio like the net income. The ratio of profit to revenue has also increased a little bit over time. And linked to that, rent phenomena and let's say the behavior of those top firms. What we have also observed is that a significant or at least a higher part of their revenue now comes from intellectual, property right, and there, obviously, you have some strong, profit shifting element that you can see, for instance, in this chart here. But I'm sure that will be developed further tomorrow by Nicholas Saxon in his lecture. So I won't address that too much this morning. And finally, coming back to those top 2,000 TNC, there has been, some study at the country level, mostly in the US by author and some co-authors, and they have basically argued that the behavior of superstar firm, let's say of very large firm, has contributed a lot to the decrease of labor income share. So what we did here is to try to give some evidence of what was happening at the world level by looking at the global functional income distribution and how that was split somehow over time. So what we have in this figure is basically the evolution of labor income over time, and we can see that that's in blue and that's decreasing. We have also the evolution of the capital income of the top 2,000 firm, which is in dark pink and in lighter pink here. So that's divided between financial and non-financial firm. And here in red we have the rest of the capital income excluding the top 2,000 TNC. So that's mostly flat. But what we observe is that over time here, the top 2,000 firms, they tend to have, let's say, a higher share in the capital income. And if you look at changes, which is provided here in that panel, what you observe is that the decrease in labor income, or the evolution of labor income, which is mostly decreasing during this period, except here during the financial crisis, basically reflect or is a mirror of the increase of the capital income of the top 2,000 TNC. So that's how. So let me now conclude for my speech today. So in short, what we can say is that trade can be an engine for development, and that has there are some interesting examples coming from East and Southeast Asia. But at the same time, the policy they implemented are far, let's say, from advising for untrammeled free trade. What we can also say is that trade under hyper-globalization has increased within country income inequality, and that has also negatively affected the aggregate demand. And that sometimes has led to some under-consumption bias or debt-led consumption, which has some negative effect for the stability of the financial system. And obviously, I mean, in a world where, I mean, growth is rather subdued, there is a tendency sometimes for government to adopt, I mean, unilateral actions to try to revigorate their own economy by trade protectionism, currency depreciation, or wage restraint. But in a sense, I mean, for us, that's clearly a problem as it risks, I mean, increasing tension between countries and also ending in a self-defeating spiral. So that's why we have, I mean, in last year's report, recommended to adopt a global New Deal, which will be also, I mean, further discussed on Thursday here. And the key element here for all trade-related questions is to have, I mean, a strong focus on employment, also to make sure that the wages and the working condition are somehow evolve in line with the productivity changes, and that we prevent also restrictive, harmful business practices linked to some monopoly or oligopoly position. And then a last important thing is to provide sufficient, I mean, policy space for a developing country to allow them to basically develop trade policy that are compatible with development and an inclusive development. So, okay, I will stop here, and we now have 15 minutes for questions or comment. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Nicola. This is the perfect opening for a session on the crisis of multilateralism, because it's a very thorough perspective on the empirical issues that are at stake. So, questions? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Hi, morning. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. There were a couple of things that caught my eye in the data that I just wanted to know if you can kind of explain, if you can look beyond the data into explanation. So,
do you mind introducing yourself, please?
Sorry, yeah. Max Walter. I run a think tank in Uganda working on economic transformation. So the first one was, have you seen any longer-term data on market concentration? Because in the graph that you showed, it looks like market concentration is quite high from the start. So I was wondering if there were bigger shifts in the long term. And the second one was, it looks like after the financial crisis, 2007, 2008, the labor share of income seems to have stabilized. So if you have any explanations for that. And then the last little one was, there was a difference between the firms that lost out their incomes between the dot-com crash and the 2007-2008 crash. I think in the first one it was the non-financial TNCs, and the second one it was the financial TNCs. Can you try to explain that?
Okay. Is there any other question, or shall I start with those one? Yes?
Good morning. I'm Carlos Guevara from the Mission of Ecuador. It was a very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. But it gave me a lot of doubts about the direction that developing countries are looking at and the policies that they are implementing, especially because of the global value chain is something that it's a topic of discussion every day, as well as economic specialization. But according to the data that we have seen this morning, the results are not what we are expecting. So my question would be, besides the Global New Deal policy recommendations, what would be the actions or the analysis that developing countries should take into account to avoid these negative impacts?
Okay. Thank you. Shall I start with those two, or was there something else? Okay. So let me now clarify a few things regarding the data. So when we look at market concentration over the long term, that's unfortunately, let's say, the data that are currently available. Prior to that, it's very hard, I mean, at least for many countries to find, let's say, disaggregated data at the firm level that allows researchers to basically build those kind of database. But I mean, my suspicion is that there are always been some strong, let's say, market concentration, and it's something that is not, let's say, a special feature from one country. For a few countries, it's really almost everywhere. If you look at some, even at the level of the firm, for some country, I mean, maybe the five, I think we have some number in the report, but the top, I mean, 5 firms, they might sometimes represent 30% or 40% of the country export. So that's, in a sense, it's it sometimes casts some doubt about some of the policy recommendation that you hear that we should develop, I mean, or allow, let's say, small and medium enterprise to export and all that. Obviously, it's not bad, I mean, if they succeed doing so. But at the end of the day, I mean, trade is mostly a matter of big firm, and I have sometimes some doubt that, let's say, pushing for a very strong involvement of small and medium enterprise in trade will really, I mean, allow a strong development process in the country. But again, it don't take me wrong, I mean, it doesn't harm, but that was just to recall that ultimately when we talk about trade, it's mostly about big firms, and they tend to have sometimes a complete different behavior than the rest of the firm in the economy. So the question is rather sometimes how to create, I mean, spillover between the large firm who export a lot and the rest of the economy, and that's obviously much more present in the manufacturing sector than in the extractive industry sector. But in short, the answer is, unfortunately, at least for many countries, we don't have, I mean, long-term market concentration figure for that. So then you say that after the global financial crisis, the labor share stabilized, and that's true. I mean, that's what we observe here. The problem, so that's what we have in the data, so I won't discuss, I won't, let's say, challenge this fact, but there were many things, I mean, happening around the global financial crisis, and profit have been, let's say, strongly hit, especially in the non-financial, in the financial sector. So for a few years, I mean, that's probably one of the reasons why we observe, let's say, a stabilization of the labor income share after the global financial crisis. The question is whether or not that will last, or if we have, I mean, after, let's say, all those 5 years, this 5 or 6 years period, which was quite different, let's say, from what happened before, because of many restructuring and all that. We don't. I mean, so far we don't really know what will happen next. But I wouldn't take that as a sign that the problem, let's say, is now solved, and at the contrary, because it's already quite at a low level compared with what we used to have in the past. Now there was a question about the difference between the .com and the global financial crisis, how that hit the income share. So what you can see is that mostly, and that's not really surprising, I mean the .com hit mostly, let's say, non-financial firm in the communication sector. So that's why you have here a very strong decline in that period for the non-financial firm. And as I said just before, after the global financial crisis, it was mostly, I mean, not only obviously, but mostly, I mean, the financial firms that were hit significantly, and that's why you have here a decline, a temporary decline of their capital, of the share of capital income for this group. So, am I answering your question? Now, coming back to the question of Ecuador, which is the $1 million or the $1 billion questions. So what to do basically to avoid some of the negative development that we have observed in developing country. So obviously, I mean, I don't have a silver bullet or an easy answer for that, but what we have argued, and that's, I think, some element of the global New Deal that we have put forward in our report is that there are some good and inspiring example coming from East Asia, Southeast Asia, where the state usually has played quite a strong role. So in basically guiding trade, making sure that exports are somehow related to the rest of the economy, that you have some links between exporting firm and the rest of the economy. So in a sense, one should not see, I mean, trade as a goal per se, but rather as a tool to allow economic development and structural change in the country. So, having said that, I mean, sometimes, especially for commodity exporting country, there is a tendency where things go well to adopt a kind of relaxed mood and to enjoy basically, and that what has happened during the commodity super cycle, to enjoy, I mean, very strong exporter revenue and all that, but at the same time, very often there hasn't been, I mean, sufficient linkages between that sector and the rest of the economy. So that's once, I mean, prices, I mean, collapse, you don't really, I mean, you are very negatively hit in terms of export revenue, and also, there is probably less space to adopt some reform, let's say, that could basically allow the country to develop the rest of the economy. So that's something maybe country have. I mean, commodity exporting country have to try to keep in mind. And but again, we don't have necessarily, I mean, a very clear answer, or we have some element we discuss in the report, but I will stop here. Okay.
Thank you, Nicolas. Okay, quickly, please.
Yeah. Hi. My name is Stephanie. I'm from the export agency from Ecuador, and my question is linked to your reply to my colleagues. You talked a lot about the China's model and the way South Asia changed this commodity structure to manufacture structure exports. I was wondering if you have any insights if this could be like something which is intrinsical to these countries because of the population and the market size of this. Also could be something that can be applied to other countries. South America went through an ISI process, and it didn't work really well, and we're still exporting commodities as well as African countries. So is there any way that we could, or some ideas that we can apply for this? Thank you.
Okay. Well, very quickly, I mean, again, it's not an easy topic. Obviously, I mean, China has some particular feature that a country like Ecuador doesn't have in terms of population, the size of its economy and all that. Now, you have some other successful economies like which are much smaller, like Singapore, for instance. So I'm not saying that it's impossible. Now, what is also true is that the current condition of in the world economy right now is probably less favorable, let's say, to that kind of development compared to what was possible, let's say, 3 or 4 decades ago. So that's why, today is not really easy for countries in Latin America, in Africa, and all that to change that path. But there are some interesting initiative at the regional level because that allows, I mean, a small country like Ecuador, let's say, to have a larger market for its product, and at the same time, you are not necessarily, let's say, affected by some of the international treaties and all that one country might sign with some developed country that then prevents some kind of development action. So, again, I mean, no specific and ready to go answer, but some element that we discuss more at length in our report. So the focus on regionalism, that's one thing,
Okay, so thanks, Nicola, for grounding us in the data aspects. Now we move on to the political economy of the crisis of multilateralism. I welcome Kevin Gallagher as the next speaker. Kevin is a professor of economics and general force of nature at Boston University, where he directs the Global Development Policy Center. He's the author of too many books, the last one of which is The China Triangle, Latin America's China Boom and the Fate of the Washington Consensus. And he's going to talk to us about his perspective on the crisis of multilateralism, and I think getting into some of the constructive elements of it.
Can we set up?
Yeah.
Can folks hear me? Well, it's a pleasure to be back at Unctad, one of my favorite international institutions, and it's great to see all of you young, vibrant, and energetic people listening to some of our boring presentations, but then asking really rich and provocative questions. And I hope to continue that once we get set up here. I think all of you have this little report called a new multilateralism for a global Green New Deal that our center did with Unctad. But it was more a collective effort. We held a number of focus groups with civil society organizations, government officials, and unions across the world, one here in Geneva and then another one in Boston that really led to that. I've been asked to focus on the trade policy aspects of that in this talk, which we'll get to in a second.
Unfortunately, they plugged the shortcut, but not the file.
Oh, you have it with you?
I have it on my laptop. Can I email it to you? Or? Got it?
She's bringing it right now.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
You have it here?
Yeah.
Well, I'll just continue the introduction that I cut because of time. And I'll say that Kevin's been an advisor of Unctad and the United Nations for a long time. He's worked on trade and financial policy issues for a long time. And he's right now chairing the Committee for Development Policy in the UN. So you can also direct your questions keeping this in mind and thinking of Kevin not just as a researcher, but also as someone who's involved with policy discussions in a very practical way.
Here you go.
Thank you.
So Gul asked, first, given the fact that a lot of you folks have a number of diverse backgrounds, some of you focus on economics, some are more international law, civil society, and government officials and so forth. So to do a very quick boot camp on how to think about the economics of trade and development very quickly, I'll give you all a quick honorary PhD in economics and then a quick honorary law degree in what the trade regime looks like. Then the third thing I'll do is here we finally have me up here. Calling my talk Reforming the Trade and Investment Regime. And in case I put you to sleep early in the morning, I'll tell you what my point is right away. Number one, that a handful of national Green New Deals won't solve the national or global crises in finance, inequality, and climate change. We really need a multilateral approach. And the multilateral trade and investment system's social foundations were eventually replaced with the globalization of capital as an ends rather than a means to achieve our social and environmental goals. And we need a global multilateral perspective if we want this to work. So as I said, I'll do a quick Trade Econ 101, an introduction to the trading system and its performance. I'll talk a little bit about the Green New Deal in the United States and why it's highly limited from a global perspective, and then talk about the elements of a global Green New Deal with a real focus on what that would mean for the global trade and investment system. So, in a nutshell, why do countries and companies and consumers want to trade? Well, we just got a question from Ecuador. It's a relatively small country. After your firm sell to everyone in Ecuador, if you have the whole world as your market, it can expand your opportunities for production. If you're a consumer, it can expand your choices and options for different things that you can't make at home that can be made in other places. Economists converge around something called the theory of comparative advantage that it determines what sectors to focus on if you're going to trade in a world economy. And the key thing is specialization, which sometimes runs across what we talk about at Unctad all the time, is that the key to development is diversification, but in trade they say, hey, wait a minute, the key to trade is specialization. But on one level, it does make a lot of sense to specialize in those things that you're relatively better off producing rather than things that are so costly for you in the short term. So it doesn't necessarily make sense for Haiti to move directly into software and nanotechnology because the cost of doing that in the short term would be extremely high. But there are more labor-intensive activities like low-skilled manufacturing and agriculture and mango production is something that a traditional economist would say to focus on. And the way to sort of gauge that, what I have here called HO, Heckscher-Ohlin, is that comparative advantage is really a function of what you're relatively abundant in. right? And in general, advanced economies are abundant in capital-intensive goods, and developing economies are relatively abundant in land and labor-intensive goods. There's another theory about who will be impacted, and that's called the Stoepler-Samuelson theory. Trade, regardless of what you pick, regardless of what you decide to focus on, because the world trading system in a nutshell right now is advanced economies have comparative advantages in sectors that are highly value added, that have lots of potential for labor and domestic demand, but developing countries by nature don't quite have the diversified economies that they want right now. Developing economies want dynamic comparative advantages. They want sectors that they can be dynamic and globally competitive in the future that they're not now, whereas the North wants to solidify and expand and basically control market share in the sectors that they focus on. So who are the winners and losers of trade policy? So say we've got the United States and Ecuador. We're going to liberalize trade between the two countries. The United States is going to export a lot more services, legal services, medical services, and things like that. And Ecuador is going to sell agricultural goods and natural resource-based goods to the United States. Okay, so since Ecuador has a relative comparative advantage in some of these agricultural and natural resource-based sectors, those sectors in the United States are going to shrink by definition. Okay, and so those sectors, which I have here on the right, are going to be the ones that don't have the comparative advantage in the United States because we're relatively factor scarce relative to Ecuador, and our firms are going to shrink. And our ability to expand those firms into the future is going to be harder to deal with, and therefore exports and production could go down. There could be downward pressure on jobs and downward pressure on wages. And so when there's a trade deal with Ecuador, like there was a proposed one about a decade ago, some of those sectors are the ones who are against it. On the Ecuador side, the winners are going to be those sectors that have a comparative advantage, the agriculture and the natural resources, because they're factor abundant in it relative to us. There's going to be higher demand in the United States, and so those exports are going to expand in Ecuador, which could provide an opportunity for more jobs in Ecuador and wages. And consumers, perhaps in both countries, could be winners because the prices and the availability of choices would be higher. So that is your PhD in economics. Now let's move to your law degree in international law and the international trade system. So we've talked a lot about the Bretton Woods Agreement. It's pretty amazing after watching this G7 about how in a couple days they couldn't really agree on anything, but in just a couple weeks, the International Monetary System, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, and all of that system was just put together in a couple weeks in the summertime in New Hampshire in 1944. One of the things that they also had on that agenda was something called an International Trade Organization, which did not get completed there. It got completed a couple years later in 1947, but it wasn't until 1994 that institution really came into fruition, not looking anything like what it had originally been conceived of, and that's down the street called the World Trade Organization. But the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was the first multilateral post-war institution, if you want to call it that, around the trading system, and it's founded. It's still there's thousands of pages of law, but it's founded on 5 key principles. One of them is called non-discrimination, or most favored nation. So if the United States and Ecuador are both members of the GATT, as the acronym is, and Ecuador is our favored country, and we want to give Ecuador 3% tariffs on all agriculture, if we have to treat Vietnam the same way. So all of the members have to have, you can't discriminate across your external memberships. That's one of the core pillars of all the treaties that run through it. Paired with that is that if you're going to treat all your international partners the same, you can't then favor your own domestic industries over those international partners. So the second key pillar is something called national treatment. That you can't go ahead and say, well, I'm going to give Ecuador and Vietnam 3% tariffs on agricultural goods, but then subsidize my domestic sector so that they're going to be more competitive than Ecuador or Vietnam. Third is reciprocity, that there are ongoing rounds. What I have on the right-hand side are the different rounds of treaties that have occurred throughout the history of the GATT that eventually turned into the WTO after the Uruguay round that finished in 1993, is reciprocity. If you're going to lower your tariffs by a certain percentage, the other country is also going to make a concession. And then over the long run, that you're moving towards some kind of universal market access, that you're not going back and increasing tariffs in a round after you just decrease them. And something that has changed over time but is still maintained as the fifth pillar of it is called SD&T, or special and differentiated treatment. Understanding that emerging market and developing economies need more time and to be able to develop dynamic comparative advantages, although the definition and the policy space for special and differentiated treatment has drastically been curtailed after the Uruguay round. The Uruguay round resulted into the World Trade Organization, which is down the street. It was seen as a grand bargain where the North, or the advanced economies, were supposed to liberalize their textile and apparel sectors and reduce the subsidization and protection of its agriculture in exchange for what we call very deep integration strategies. Regardless of what they say in the Financial Times, trade and tariffs are actually quite low in the world, drastically reduced since the World War, since the post-war period. And therefore, the discussion about trade liberalization and comparative advantage has moved to what we call non-tariff barriers. Since tariffs and quotas are really low, firms and especially advanced economies see your environmental regulations or your copyright and innovation policies as barriers to trade. And so the deal of the Uruguay round was essentially the North saying, we will liberalize textiles and apparel and loosen the protections on our agricultural sector because the South had relative comparative advantages in low-skilled manufacturing and agriculture in exchange for very deep integration and a whole bunch of new treaties that I list here on the right-hand side on your technical standards, sanitary standards, subsidy regimes, services, intellectual property, and investment rules. And that was the deal. And so the trade regime now at the WTO is a couple thousand pages that really takes those 5 core principles and cuts into pretty much every kind of economic activity, which is why the negotiations are often so tenuous now, for 2 reasons, one good one and one bad one. The good one is, relative to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, where the Europeans get to pick the head of the IMF and the U.S. Has veto power, and at the World Bank, where the United States gets to pick the head of the World Bank and has veto power, the WTO has a one country, one vote system. And so that has really created a lot of opening for interesting coalitions between G77, what used to be called the G22, the NAMA 11, all different kinds of coalitions across different kinds of countries that have been very successful. One of the reasons why the Doha round is dormant is because the advanced economies and the newly industrialized countries like Singapore and South Korea really pushed an even deeper integration agenda, but developing countries were able to create a coalition that has basically stopped that. The bad news is because of that, the United States engaged in a policy called competitive liberalization, where they're basically trying to create a coalition of very deep trade and investment agreements with countries of the willing or countries that they can pressure more in bilateral negotiations. So when Peru was part of the WTO, they were part of the G22, a group of agricultural producers, but which was also in alignment with something called the NAMA 11, manufacturing producers in developing countries, and they pushed back on deep investment rules, getting rid of innovation and intellectual property and so forth. But when the United States goes into a bilateral agreement with them and says, the good news is your generalized system of preferences, which we've had since the Cold War, that gives you duty-free access to the United States economy, we're going to make that permanent for you so you don't have to go to Congress every few years. But in exchange for that, you're going to have to, the ticket to access to the United States economy is going to be all this deeper stuff. And there has been over 2,500 free trade agreements, as they're so-called, and bilateral investment treaties that have really proliferated, as you can see here, since the end of the Uruguay round and the beginning of the Doha round. So the good news is at the multilateral forum, where there's, because of a one country, one vote system and very creative coalitions among developing countries, there's been able to be a standstill and a rejection of some of these deeper policies that really cut into policy space. Unfortunately, the United States and the Europeans after them, and now Japan after them, and China is now getting into the game as well, have moved into these exploiting asymmetric bargaining power with larger economies and smaller economies to get much deeper agreements than anything you could ever get at the WTO. And their long-term strategy is, if we can get all these smaller agreements, then you multilateralize them up. And so you basically surround Brazil, the old Brazil, China, South Africa, and et cetera, and you create all these parallel agreements that those countries are going to eventually have to move into. Okay, that's your law degree. Let's talk about trade and investment policy today. This is just some of the stuff that you've seen in the previous presentation and the TDRs every year, is that we really mark the hyper-globalization period as taking off in the early 1980s. And one of the things that we keep getting stressed is that GDP did increase by at least a factor of 7, trade by a factor of 10, FDI even more, but the real increase in globalization has been in the financial sector, which is increased by orders of magnitude to over $300 trillion by 2016. And alongside of that has been a major doubling of carbon dioxide emissions on the planet and an increasing shrinking of the labor share of value, not only in the South but in the North as well. These two are to me, in our report that we did with Unctad, are in many ways the saddest aspects of it, because the orange line here is the massive increase in theoretically available finance through the financialization. But on the other hand, the blue lines, both for the developed economies on your left and the developing economies on my right, is that gross fixed capital formation, or actual investment into economies, has been stagnant or declining. And so this is leading to all the drastic inequalities that you've seen in everybody else's presentations. There is still a Doha round on the table, and if you listen to the G77 yesterday, the G7 yesterday, there's a big push to move back into WTO negotiations, and there's still a rash of bilateral investment treaties and regional trade agreements that are on the table, where largely northern countries and some of the NICs are trying to exploit asymmetric bargaining power to get really deep trade agreements with countries in the South. And the issue now is that because trade liberalization is pretty strong, that the benefits of new agreements are really small, and the costs in terms of regulatory policy space, lost tariff revenues, and south-north transfers from intellectual property are really high. Let me just go through some of these really quick. The World Bank estimates that the likely benefits of a Doha round, of what's basically has been sitting on the table for a long time, are only going to bring about $96 billion of increased GDP in the world economy, which is 0.23% of GDP relative to the base year where the modeling was done. But I circle the developing countries here because per capita gains for developing countries are going to be 25 times the gains for developing countries. On top of that, there's going to be massive tariff losses. Unctad in 2005 analyzed what the tariff losses would be just from reducing industrial tariffs under the WTO round. They'd be $63.4 billion. So you get a $16 billion one-time bump through trade liberalization, but you lose $63.4 billion in tariff revenues. And according to the World Bank, there'd be an annual loss of $41 billion of transfers from the South to the North because of the more increased intellectual property provisions that would be in there that would make you have to license technologies from the North. In addition to that, there'd be an incredible encroachment on policy space for diversification. All the policies you talked about in the TDR in the last session, industrial policies that deal with tariff sequencing, development banking, subsidizing certain industries, favoring certain industries. Those are fundamental violations of this national treatment clause within the WTO, and even deeper violations in investment provisions of different treaties, intellectual property provisions of treaties, and services provisions of treaties. So at the multilateral level, there's really a clash of globalizations. The South understands that globalization can be a good thing. It can expanding markets for them and expanding choices for them. However, the core organizing principle for the South is dynamic comparative advantage. We want to be able to create the policy space to diversify our economies, to be able to have sectors that are going to make us better off moving into the future, even though we might sacrifice some of our economy in the short term to be better off in the long run. Whereas the North really wants to solidify and expand market share in the sectors where they're already the strongest. Those two, that graph that was showed in the last one of those 200 TNCs that have captured so much of global GDP, they want to maintain and expand that market share at the cost of the South being able to do it. So let's talk about a Green New Deal. One of the most exciting things, which we're looking for every day in the United States, is that there is a renewed scrutiny of globalization, of the way that the rules have been written over the past 20 years within the advanced economies. There really was in the early 1990s, and it was with youth that were completely outside of the whole decision-making process. We'd have huge protests at every single meeting, but it would never penetrate the politics. But Donald Trump, in many ways, was elected because of the deindustrialization of America and perhaps the Democratic Party abandoning that traditional working-class base and the working-class base giving a shot at this guy who's completely betrayed them. And therefore, there's a new energy around what a more progressive rewriting the rules of globalization would be for workers in the environment. And this is a potential for a new coalition of decision makers in the North and decision makers in the South. So what is a Green New Deal? What is it in the United States? If you see in the background here, we have my former student, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a new congresswoman from New York, and Edward Markey, a long-term senator from Massachusetts, who introduced comprehensive climate change legislation during the Obama administration, but the Obama administration tanked it. Those two have introduced a very short, it's called a bill, called a Green New Deal, but it's really just a 14-page document with two things. One, we need a green structural transformation in the United States, which entails a decommissioning of coal and all other fossil fuels over time, and massive industrial policy into sustainable infrastructure and green technologies. Those are the three core components of it, and understanding that transformation is going to create significant job losses in incumbent industries like oil, natural gas, and coal, but incredible opportunities in renewable energy and infrastructure provision and so forth. And so it equally commits to what we call a just transition, to make sure that there are opportunities for folks to be able to move into these new dynamic industries, and so they don't get left behind the way that they've been left behind through the globalization process since 1980. And so in addition to green structural transformation, the bill says that we need to ensure a just transition through universal health care, job guarantees, and rights of collective bargaining into new sectors, and education and training. Because if you're working in a coal plant, it's not necessarily as easy just to move right into renewable energy technologies and so forth. What's wrong with this plan from a global perspective? One is that one country can't solve the global inequality and climate breakdown. Right? These are global public good problems, and nations need to coordinate and cooperate to succeed. Also, a Green New Deal in the North could result into dumping into the South. In the United States, if we switch to electric vehicles, That's going to create an incredible amount of demand for lithium and other kinds of extractivism in the South, which can lock in commodity dependence and the toxic impacts of that kind of extraction on local communities in those countries. And so we need to make sure that that's squared. China as well, I would say China is also a leader in a Green New Deal at home. They're the leaders in electric vehicles. They're now the world's most productive and largest solar, and basically taking over the wind markets as well. But what they're doing is exporting their coal. They've capped coal. They have a coal cap. They've hit their peak coal consumption in 2013. But since 2013, they're taking their National Development Bank and financing their coal companies to build coal in South Africa, Malawi, Indonesia, Vietnam, and so forth. So that's why that's another example, a U.S.-related example and a Chinese example where there's significant movement in the United States and China domestically, but they're on another level, globalizing their problem or exporting the problem to other countries. And third, most of the national and global actions needed are illegal under most of the trade and investment treaties that are out there now and scorned by the other international financial institutions. So we really need to multilateralize to a global Green New Deal. We put out a report, you can see the cover of it in the corner here, called Trade in the Balance, Reconciling Trade and Climate Policy. And a massive global trade reform would basically have to be done on two principles. One, prioritize the global flows of climate-friendly goods and services. And number two, restrict the global flows of goods and services that accentuate climate change. This is essentially what the World Bank and the multilateral development banks have moved to do. Since 2015, the World Bank and all the multilateral development banks now will not finance coal except for very, very extreme circumstances. And now they have all pledged that they won't finance any upstream oil and gas. And that they're committing to moving from the IDB 30% of their balance sheet to the ADB 70% of their balance sheet into green technologies. And the World Bank is doing some financing in South Africa towards a just transition to make sure all those folks in the coal industry can move into some of the new. On one level, some of the international institutions are starting to have this. The trade investment couldn't be more stuck in the 1990s. Than any other of the international institutions. If you look at what some of the specific policies of a Green New Deal would be, both in the North and in the South, almost all of them would be violations under contemporary trade and investment treaties. So on the left-hand side, I have different instruments. Say you raise tariffs on all fossil fuels and lower them on clean technology, that would be a complete violation of the WTO and all the trade and investment regimes in the goods and in the services parts. And another fundamental principle I didn't talk about is that you can't discriminate on what are called like products. And so according to the WTO, there's no difference between a wind farm and a coal plant, that it's energy provision. And so you can't discriminate against one versus the other. Fundamental violation of all trade and investment treaties. That's a fundamental principle that goes through it. Non-discrimination on like products. So that needs to be changed. If you banned FDI and fossil fuels over time and encourage green FDI, same thing, it'd be violation of services and investment treaties. If you required north-south clean technology transfer, right? We don't want the Japanese and the Chinese have all the patents on electric vehicles, clean technology, and so forth, right? If you wanted to have compulsory licensing to be able to diffuse all of these technologies throughout the world to make sure they don't concentrate market power in the South and the NICs, that would be fundamental violations of investment treaties, investment provisions, and services. If you subsidize clean energy and sustainable infrastructure, that would run right up against national treatment in general and all the subsidies provisions in many of these treaties. If you decommissioned existing coal and eventually phased out other fossil fuel plants, that would be a fundamental violation of what in regional trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties is called fair and equitable treatment. That there are clauses that firms have written in there that say, look, if the regulatory environment changes, that's tantamount to expropriation. If you're going to decommission my coal plant, you're basically doing what Saudi Arabia did to the oil companies in the 1950s and 1960s. You're confiscating our assets. And one thing that I failed to mention about the regional trade agreements, the northern-led regional trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties, is that corporations get to govern them. The losers get to govern them through something called ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement. The World Trade Organization has state-to-state. So governments get to deal with each other and go through a dispute resolution mechanism, whereas these new North-South bilateral investment treaties and FTAs, the corporations themselves get to sue governments. So Chevron has been long-term in suing Ecuador because Ecuador increased its environmental regulations in the Amazon. But that meant that countries that are drilling holes wherever they want to and pushing indigenous people off their land saw that as tantamount to expropriation, and they've taken Ecuador to private tribunals. And so the way that the dispute resolution is set up is it gives the power to the large firm losers. And so decommissioning plants and increasing environmental regulations, fundamental violation of some of those. If you put in place capital controls and strong regulations for the financial system, right now, one of the things you saw through the 2018 TDR is that the financial system is run amok, right? It sees its own expansion as its own ends rather than serving the productive economy. And so if we put on international capital controls to regulate booms and busts, and if we regulated domestic financial systems so the finance and banking sector was going into investing in transitions, investing in new technologies, industrial policy, they would also be able to sue, and they would be illegal. Job guarantees you can do under any trade agreement. Universal health care is a problem under TRIPS, because obviously TRIPS monopolizes, or intellectual property provisions monopolize big pharma. Most of these rules have been written by the pharmaceuticals industry, and they, by definition, massively increase the price of drugs. And so it would be very difficult to have universal health care that wouldn't put a country or a consumer bankrupt. Education and training is still 100%. There's policy space for that under trade and investment treaties. And if we move back to state-to-state dispute resolution, that would be in violation of about 2,000 free trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties. If you think about health care, financial reform, environmental protection, and increasing wages and equality, there's been numerous ISDS cases where private corporations have directly sued states outside of state-to-state dispute resolution through these private tribunals on issues related to healthcare, financial reform, environmental protection, and wages and inequality. Canada tried to loosen drug patents for universal healthcare, and Lilly in the United States has taken them to ISDS tribunals. Uruguay tried to have a tobacco law to have just warnings in health about tobacco. Philip Morris took them. There was in a famous case when Greece did its sovereign debt restructuring, that they were taken to court by a Ukrainian bank, and the Czech Republic had a too big to fail rule that bailed out certain banks but not others, and they were taken to one of these. I mentioned Chevron versus Ecuador. Peru has tried to increase regulations about the use of toxics in the mining sector so that the agricultural sector doesn't get destroyed from the runoff from the toxics, and the community's water doesn't get contaminated, and therefore they don't get hurt. Renco, a United States company, took Peru. Egypt tried to increase the minimum wage. That was seen as tantamount to expropriation. And South Africa famously got challenged for its black empowerment law, and that's what's triggered that country in really being a leader in trying to divest from these different ISDS provisions and treaties. Just reforming the trade and investment regime won't be enough. The rest of the multilateral system has to be calibrated to this kind of transition. And in the world of money and finance, We need multiple currencies. A world that's just linked to the dollar is beholden to United States monetary policy, and therefore, when interest rates are low, there's surges in dollar-denominated capital flows. When there's uncertainty like there is now, where interest rates are going up, there's sudden stops and a rush back to the United States, which increases debt, dollar-denominated debt. We need multiple currencies. We need climate stress testing of assets in different countries. And this is something that's happening. There's 34 central banks around the world that have created a green network, and they're doing climate stress testing. They're realizing that in the Caribbean, a lot of the bank loans are in sectors that as sea levels rise and hurricanes occur, that they're going to be wiped out, that could have a significant impact on the financial system. The Europeans are realizing there's been a climate stress test of the European Central Bank, and they're exposed to a lot of coal plants in Central and Eastern Europe, and when those get closed, that's going to have real impacts on the financial system. There needs to be coordinated capital controls for two reasons. One, to manage these surges and sudden stops in capital flows, but two, to free up resources in the South to be able to finance the green transition, the green and the just transition. I think Unctad is about to come out with a report that shows that there's a net transfer from the South to the North in terms of self-insurance, the accumulation of reserves, because no one wants to go to the International Monetary Fund. So there's $600 billion a year that the South transfers to the North in the form of treasury bills and other assets like that, which if they replace that with capital controls to buttress the inflow and outflow of capital, then they'd be able to divert much more of that capital into new public banks, sovereign wealth funds, and prudent fiscal outlays. Finally, the International Monetary Fund and the regional financial arrangements need to shift from pro-cyclical rescue packages to counter-cyclical and green rescue packages. Sorry to keep mentioning Ecuador, but the Ecuadorians have a package with the IMF right now, and almost everything on this left-hand side they have to get rid of. They had to get rid of their capital controls. They have to shrink the amount of financing going into structural transformation rather than expanding it. On the other side, in the world of development finance, we need to reform the World Bank and the MDBs. As I said, they are shifting. The great thing about them is that they have a policy shift to move into different sectors and to finance a just transition, but they're still too dominated by the North. They get picked. The heads always get to be Americans, and Americans always get to veto at the board, and that needs to be changed. They need to do a better job of carbon and long-run pricing. And while I point out this interesting World Bank loan in South Africa for a transition, development banks, in addition to providing long-run finance to tee up the transition, they really also need to focus on the adjustment process, to making sure that folks who are going to lose jobs in sectors are going to be able to be on the frontier of the new sectors moving forward. We need to establish a lot more development finance institutions. According to our calculations, there's a couple hundred of them, and collectively they have more assets than all of the multilaterals combined. But that's really just because of the Brazilian National Development Bank and the Chinese. If you take them away, lots of countries have them, but they're very, very small. And that we need some sort of a coordinating body around multilateral and national development finance. Right now, the only coordination are these multilateral Western-led clubs, right? In October and April of every year, the World Bank and the IMF get together, but the China Development Bank, the Development Bank of South Africa, they're not part of this. There is a new thing called the International Development Finance Club, which is run by largely southern development banks, that has started to coordinate. And in Poland in 2018, they all committed to align themselves to the Paris Climate Agreement. So that's a great step in that direction. Finally, my last slide is that if in rethinking the multilateral system, what we put together in these focus groups, and that is in our document, are a couple design principles. What would be the design principles for a multilateral system that allowed for the policy space for this kind of work? One, right up at the chapeau, you've heard a lot about about the Bretton Woods Agreement. In that time, it was in the post-depression world, and the core thing was we need full employment for everybody in the world, and we need countries to be able to make sure that that we want to expand the trading system, but keep finance at home. Make sure finance is steered towards productive investment and full employment. Those were sort of the core principles there. Here, in the 21st century, we need shared goals for a just transition. We need to have coordinated industrial policy and sustainable infrastructure investment around the world in a way that reduces inequality and brings people into higher standards of living. That needs to be baked into the chapeau across all of the international institutions. We also have to understand that slightly different than what we have in the trade regime, which is special and differentiated treatment, the environmental regime has a concept called common but differentiated responsibility. So in the common but differentiated responsibility would basically say that yes, the North and the South are committed to a green structural transformation across the world that also lifts up people and creates sustainable livelihoods. But since the climate problem has been an industrialized country created problem, now with China almost at equal footing in what they've contributed to the atmosphere, that those countries need to do more towards the shared common goal than, say, Vietnam or Indonesia. A third core plank needs to be policy space for national sovereignty. The different countries are going to have different Green New Deals, right? In the North, where we have a massive carbon-focused economy, we have to spend a lot of time on decommissioning old things and replacing that capital stock with new things. Whereas Africa is having this massive demographic transition and doesn't have grids that are already focused on fossil fuels and so forth. Theirs is more new capital stock and transferring away from resource-intensive activity. So different countries are going to have different national Green New Deals. They're going to have different policy instruments, and we need to make sure that the countries have policy space for those national strategies under trade and investment treaties that are supported and calibrated through the development banking system and the monetary and financial system. But the key component that is going to take some real negotiation is to make sure that one country's green industrial strategy doesn't prevent another country from pursuing those, right? We can't have beggar thy neighbor policies that will derail the entire thing. And that's what the crux of the negotiations will have to be about. And we'll also have to have balanced and open dispute resolution. Investor-state dispute resolution is absolutely antithetical to being able to move forward on multilateralism, because all of the policies for green structural transformation could be challenged by fossil fuel industries, invested in pharmaceuticals industries, and the financial sector, which are the vested incumbents in the economy that we have today. I am somewhat optimistic because the advanced economies are finally coming around. It used to be that when productivity increases were matched with wage increases in the North, that there was somewhat of a coalition between capital and labor about Northern-led trade and investment policy. But now we've seen that the capital has left labor behind and the environment's gotten really screwed in the North. And so there's a new constituency that is becoming manifest in things like the Green New Deal in the United States and similar efforts in and around the Labour Party in the UK, where there is an equal space. If you look at Elizabeth Warren's trade policy in her campaign, she wants massive industrial policy for the United States to be able to transform. And so there's never been, the Democratic Party has never wanted, in its contemporary form since the Clinton administration, has never looked at industrial policy as a good thing. And so now there could be an alignment. North and Southern countries want industrial policy for different things, want policy space for different things. There's an equal disdain in the North and South about ISDS. I think one of the key things that has always been an issue is collective bargaining and unionization. The North, those constituencies that have been really hard hit in the north that are really part of this new progressive alternative. They're going to want to, they really want to unionize and have collective bargaining in the north, and they want to limit the ability of firms that don't have that in the south to sell to the north. That's always been a long-standing conflict in the trade system. We're going to have to deal with that. I have no more time, but we have a whole bunch of studies on this stuff at the Global Development Policy Center. You can go to our webpage, www.bu.edu/GDP. Thanks a lot.
After such an interesting discussion on the Global Green New Deal with Kevin Gallagher, we have now an Unctad expert, Pier Giuseppe Fortunato. We call him Pep. Floor is yours, Pep.
Thank you very much, Gul. It's a pleasure to be here and take part to this very interesting, for what I've seen up to date, summer school. So I'm happy to share some of the work that we are doing. In particular, what I'm going to do today is discussing one paper which is in your reading list, which I published last year together with Richard Kotzer-Wright, the director of the division that you met yesterday. But that's part of the presentation. I will also try to extend from this and expose you to some of the research that we are currently doing at Unctad. What this topic will be about, as I announced yesterday, we'll be discussing mostly global value chains and regional value chains, so the international production network, so to speak. I'll present you some data on the evolution of these networks, which are the great novelty, if you want, of the last 15 to 20 years, and try to highlight what are the challenges that developing countries face in order to take full advantage from these international production networks. And of course, once we highlight the challenges, what we'll try to do next step is try to go in the direction of some policy implication. So what can be done concretely by the government, in particular in developing economies, to take full advantages of this opportunity and try to avoid some of the risks which are related with participation to global value chains. And in particular, what I will talk about is a bit about what I call strategic liberalization. That is the idea of trying to choose in which kind of sector, on which direction try to liberalize the economy in order to exploit these opportunities. 55 years ago, Bob Dylan was singing that the times are changing, and actually that's the reality that we are witnessing. I guess this morning Nicholas showed you some of the evidence on the dramatic increase, for example, in world trade flows in the 20 years, not only in the flows, but also in the direction of these flows, with an increasing involvement of developing countries. So I will not repeat what Nicholas did. Let me add on that, along with an increase in trade flows, what we've been witnessing has been an incredible increase in foreign direct investment. Yesterday, Mario's presentation was trying to assess the impact of these FDI on human development, because FDI are an important reality. They have become more and more important in the last 20 years. Why this is the case? Well, because thanks to an increased foreign investment, we are witnessing what is probably the most important change in the last 20-year global economy, which is the restructuring of global production. Before, 20, 30 years ago, most of the products which were produced and exported were produced in one country. The entire value chain would lead to the production of one good, that is designing the product, doing the research and development, then producing the different components, assembling these components and selling it abroad, were done mostly in one country or in two countries at most. Now that these things, in particular in certain sectors like automotive, like electronics, like textile, is completely changed. Now different tasks are performed in different countries, so the production and the value chain has been sliced across different countries. These new organizational production is known as the production on global value chain. So the value chain has become now fully global and fully globalized. Now here for you just some data to have an idea of the dimension of this phenomenon. One of the critical variables that we use to measure global value chain and insertion in global value chain is what we call foreign value addition. What is the foreign value addition? Well, if we think to a particular chain, to a particular production, so let's take production of a Toyota car, the foreign value addition related to this chain is the share of value addition which goes not to the final exporter, which may be, for example, Japan or Korea, but to countries which are outside the final exporter, because the final exporter has, for example, had to acquire intermediate outputs, or in most cases, much the great majority of the value addition of the production comes from other countries. So the foreign value addition related to each specific product is a good measure of the internationalization of the specific global value, of the specific value chain. In this picture, we have data coming for the world input-output data set, which presents some very interesting data. That's a data set which is managed by the University of Groningen. What I have is that each one of the data points that you see here is one specific value chain. We have over 300 value chains, so 300 products which are traded across the world, okay? What we're doing here is simply having on the horizontal axis what was the foreign value addition for each one of these chains in 1995, and on the vertical axis, the foreign value addition which was in 2008, so 15 years later. And as you can see, for the great majority of these change, around 85–90%, the points on this graph are above the 45-degree lines, which means that for the great majority of these change, the foreign value addition is now much higher than it was 15 years ago, which is a strong evidence on the fact that most of the chain around the world, most of the products which are produced and exported around the world are now based on a much more international production, which is a good news. Okay, we are happy. Why we are happy about that? Well, because one of the things that when we think to development, one of the problems that developing countries experienced is that, well, before global value chains, or before this level of diffusion of global value chains, to take benefit of participating to international markets, you need to be able to produce, you need to be able to perform all the tasks along the value chain of a product. If I want to take the benefit of international markets, I need to be able to produce an entire car, an entire microchip, an entire T-shirt, okay? Now this is no more the case. Since the production is sliced across different countries, a developing country can specialize in one specific task along the chain and then taking some of the benefits, some of the advantages of participating to the global value chain. So that's apparently good news. But then when we look to the data and to the real impact that these global value chains are having on developing countries, well, the evidence is much more puzzled. And we are not that much convinced from the data that we see that these benefits have, in fact, materialized. What I'm showing here is a graph, actually, that we have done. That's part of the work that we are currently doing with the OECD Development Center. What we're doing here is thinking to the different value chains across the world. In particular, we are thinking about three sectors, which are the most internationalized sector: automotive, electronics, and textile, which cover over the 95% of entire global value chains around the world. Each one of these data points is one specific country sector. So we have, for example, this is the electronic sector in Philippines, the electronic sector in China. So you have around 70 countries here, because these are the countries of the TIVA data set, and for each country we have 3 data points, okay, which represent the state of the art of that specific sector in that country. And we are looking in 2 dimensions, which we think are particularly important for development. The first one is, for example, China. What is the share of the value addition from the export in the electronic sector that each country is taking? So this is, if you want, is changing in the value addition, okay? Is foreign value addition in particular. Moving towards the left of this horizontal axis, we have countries which have been increasing the domestic value addition in the last 15 years on a single product, okay? So if I am here, this is the southwest of the picture, this means that I'm increasing the share of value addition that I'm taking from a product, okay? If I am on the right side instead, this means that I'm losing value addition, okay? That's the variation in terms of value addition, okay? On the vertical axis, we have the other dimension, which we think is particularly important when we think to development, which is changes in employment, okay? So if I am on the north of this picture, this means that employment in this sector is increasing in the specific country I'm looking at. And if I am in the south of this picture, this means that I'm losing employment, okay? I had less employment now than I am in the past, okay? So what we would like to see is most of the country in the northwest part of this picture. That is, the countries which are here are countries which are both experiencing more control on the value chain, that is, taking more value addition, and which are also enjoying a growing employment, okay? While what we see is that in the last 15 years, very few countries and in very few sectors managed to do that. It's basically an issue of China, which in electronics, in manufacturing, in automotive and textile is doing that, and few other countries, mostly from the Far East Asia. Okay, most of the developing economies are here. That is our country, which we define countries as deepening and assembly, which in the last 15 years have been witnessing an increasing employment in these sectors, but also they are losing out in terms of value addition. Okay, so most of developing countries have been participating more to global value chain, but getting less and less benefit. While on the other hand, most of developed countries are on the southwest. That is, are taking more and more advantages in terms of value addition, but they are losing employment. This is outsourcing. This is a way of seeing outsourcing. But what you are seeing here is that actually developing countries are taking much less benefit than what you would like to see. Now, the question is, and the question that we try to address, why this is the case. And there are various ways you can look at the data and understand why this is the case. One way of looking at data is what Morel did, for example, in 2015 in a very nice paper. Here is considered in two dimensions. The first one is participation to global value chain, which is the sum of foreign value addition of your exports. So how much of your export is value which goes to other countries, but also of domestic value addition on foreign export. That is, I can sell intermediates to another country which finally export a good and taking some of the benefit. And on the other hand, you have the distance from the final demand. What is the distance for the final demand? Well, these basically operations which are close to the final demand are operations which are close to the consumer products. Okay, so that's basically the share of export that goes directly to the consumer tells me how close I am to the final demand. The farther I am to the final demand, the lower is this share. Okay? So what you can see in this picture, well, first of all, you can see that there is a positive correlation between participation and distance from the final demand. That is, the countries which participate more in global value chain are more distant from the final demand. Are countries which usually source primary products like natural resources, raw materials, or raw labor. Okay? And also that bigger country and richer country, which are here the size of the circle, are countries which tend to participate less and be close to the final demand. Because if you are close to the final demand, you are running operation with higher value addition. And here you have all the OECD economies. Okay? So basically what we are observing is that the countries which participate more to global value chain are developing countries where I'm outsourcing some part of the production, but this part of the production is very far from the consumer demand, is tend to be very much upstream, and this gives me very low value addition. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why most of developing countries end up to be in the northeast of this picture. Okay, we are working now on this data to see the dynamics in most important developing countries. This is part of the work we're doing right in these days. Here again, we have the same two dimensions that I was showing you before: participation to global value chain on the horizontal axis, and distance from the final demand on the vertical axis. And here I'm studying 10, 12 actually developing economies, the ones for which we have the data from the TIVA dataset. And here we have for each country 2 data points. One is the situation in 2015 and the other in 2011. So what we notice from this graph is that for most developing economies, participation has been increasing as well as distance from final demand. That is, we are moving in a sense in the wrong direction, getting less and less benefit. One country here as the outlier is China. What's happened in China? Well, in China, distance from final demand increased. That's the emergence of China as a big exporter of intermediate products. If I export intermediates goods, I'm not close to final demands. But on the other hand, the participation has been decreased. Okay, that's why this is the case. Because if you disaggregate data, you realize that foreign value addition in Chinese export has been reduced a lot in the last 15 years. So again, that's another way of looking at the data on China. I guess Nicolas shared with you some consideration of the trade data on China. These are more production data of China. We show you how China is different from the other developing economies. And once again, this is a way to each of some of the work that you have done last year in the TDR to see that this miracle of the rise of the South we all talk about is, in the end of the day, a very different story once we disaggregate the data. And also on the production side, you realize that there are huge differences in terms of the kind of integration of the international markets of the Chinese experience with respect to the experience of other developing economies. Now, let me skip this. I don't want to give you too much details on that. But the other thing which is important to say at this point is that another way of looking at why developing countries are not taking advantages from participation to global value chain is actually looking at what we call the smiling curve. What is the smiling curve? Well, it's a way of describing the entire value chain which leads to the production of a final good, or an exported final good, okay? What we have is that the operation at the beginning and at the end of the chain, that is the research and development and the design operation which takes place at the beginning when I have to think to a product, and the operation which takes place at the end, the marketing or the post or the service which takes place after having sold the product. Well, these operations, the logistics operation, these operations are characterized by much higher value addition than the operation which takes place at the middle step of the chain, which tend to be usually the production of components and the assembly of the components. Actually, assembling the components is the easiest thing that you can do, and the one with less value addition, therefore the one which is pay lower wages. At the end of the day, this is the story. Now, what's happened is that in an internationalized market for production, in which we are trading not only the goods, but the factor of production, each country tends to specialize with respect and given its comparative advantage, in a very similar way of what you observe with trade. Now, what is the comparative advantage of developing economies? Usually tend to be unskilled labor and very low-skilled labor. That is, these countries tend to specialize in assembly and production of components, which are the operation along the value chains, which tend to be associated with less value addition. While developed and advanced economies like the United States of America, Japan, and European countries tend to specialize in those activities for which they have a comparative advantage, which are activities in which you need high-skilled labor, engineers, researchers, and specialists of markets and logistics. That's why when we slice the production along the value chain, rich countries are taking the lion's share. Because in rich countries, where there is usually the center of the multinational corporation, you do research and development, you do design operation, you do services, you do marketing, you do logistics. That's another way of understanding why the evolution of global value chain, the emergence of global value chain, incredible growth of global value chain did not pay off in development terms as we would have wished to. Okay, that's basically a recap of what I just told you for the evidence that we look at. In the last 15, 20 years, developing economies have been specializing mostly in tasks which are related with the use of raw labor or very low-skilled labor and primary resources. So the big challenge that we face right now in development perspective is trying to help these developing countries to upgrade along global value chain. It's not a matter of escaping from global value chain, but of taking advantage of these global value chains. And what you need to do is try to upgrade along these chains. Now, if you have clear in mind this story, then this kind of data, which puzzled us a couple of years ago with our common friend, where we're working with this with our common friend Elisa Brownstein on the TDR of the 2016. Well, what we were doing here is a simple scatter plot, actually, in which we were looking at changing in export share of manufacturing versus changing in value-added share of manufacturing. Okay, so the way in which you think to economics is that if I export more, I'm going to get more value out of it. Okay, so what we did is basically a scatter plot. On the horizontal axis, we have the variation between 1994 and 2014, so it's around 20 years in terms of export of manufacturing, so the share of manufacturing in your total export. And the horizontal axis, we look at the share of manufacturing in your GDP, in your total value creation. And what we realized is that, to much of our surprise at the beginning, most of the countries these are just developing economies coming from Africa, Latin America, and Asia. So most of the developing economies in these 20 years witnessed an important increase in export of manufacturing. That is, the export of manufacturing became more important, which is a good news for the way we are used to think to the structural transformation of economics. But the other news is that the great majority of these countries are on the left of this line, which means together with an increase in export of manufacturing, they also experience a decrease in the value addition coming from manufacturing, which is particularly surprising. And as you can see, again, the only country which managed to experience both growth in manufacturing and export and growth in manufacturing value addition are in the northwest part of this picture, and are the green countries, which are the Asian economy. So the Malaysia of this world, the Thailand of this world, of course the China of this world, and so on and so forth. Why this is the case? Because here the picture is with gross exports, so the total of your export. If we consider instead net exports, that is your total export of manufacturing minus your total imports of manufacturing, then the picture makes much more sense. Because now we realize that most of developing countries also imported a lot of manufacturing products, because these are the intermediates that you need before having to assemble the product and adding this few value addition that you have. So the story that I told you before makes sense of this puzzle. Again, another evidence on the fact that developing countries are not taking enough advantages from the global markets as they are operating right now, and for the international production networks as they are operating right now. Now, so if it is clear, this picture will also be particularly clear. This is basically telling you how the global cake of value addition coming from export is divided across countries of the world. And again, not surprisingly, almost 70% of the total value addition is going to developed economies, and the great majority of the rest is going to big developing economies, China most important, while very few of these is going, not even the 10%, is going to other developing economies, even including big developing economies like, for example, Brazil. So that's, again, the picture of a world trade which has increased in a dramatic way, but again, for different reasons related to the trade side of the story and to the production side of the story, has not been paying off on developing economies as we would have liked and as we would have hoped to 30 years ago. Another thing is interesting to looking at when we look to global value chain. To the moment we have looked at distribution of the benefit coming from global value chain across different countries of the world. Another thing that you can look at is at looking at how these benefits are distributed across different factors of production. So what are the factors of production which are gaining more from this reorganization of the global production along international production networks? And here we are using the same data that we used before. So these are the data from the world input to output data set. Each one of these data points is one specific value chain, one product, okay? What we are doing here is just look, for example, at the left side of the picture. Here we have the share of the total value addition coming from the production of any one of these goods going to high-skilled labor, okay? On the horizontal axis, we have the share which was going to high-skilled labor in 1995, and on the vertical axis, we have the same thing from 2008, okay? So what you can notice is that the great majority, for the great majority of these value chains, which are around 90% of global value chains, the points lies above the 45-degree lines. That is, in the great majority of global value chain, high-skilled labor was getting in 2008 much more than it was getting 15 years before. So one of the impact of the reorganization of work along value chain has been giving more advantage to high-skilled labor. And the very same things, this kind of picture talks a lot with what I guess Kevin was discussing with you before, and increasing inequality. One of the sources of the increasing inequality is, of course, the increasing functional inequality, the distribution of total value addition across different factors of production. And here we can notice, as I told you, a huge increase along all the value chains in high-skilled labor, and an important decrease across, again, all the value chains on low-skilled labor. If you extend to this, you can notice there is an increase of the share of global production, of the share of global value addition going to high-skilled labor and to capital, and an important decrease of global value addition along almost all the value chains going to low-skilled labor and to primary products, to primary inputs. And of course, those countries which are rich of high-skilled labor are developed economy, and those countries which are rich of low-skilled labor are mostly developing economies. So what to do? Okay, so let me now move in my last 15 minutes to the policy part of this story. So what we need to do? Well, of course, whenever we talk about redistribution, it's usually a political economy story, as Richard was discussing with you at the beginning of your summer school. The idea is how power is redistributed has an impact on how the benefit of those production, the value addition, is distributed. And in many cases, the power of the value chain also depends. Milberg has been wrote extensively about this, on the characteristic of the firm, the size, the capability of the firms, and the difference, for example, between the skills and the capabilities of a multinational corporation and the skills and the capabilities available in the country where this multinational corporation is operating, where the FDI is flowing in. Okay, so what the government can do? Well, we can organize the kind of intervention of the government in 4 different characteristics. First of all, we have the negotiating the contract with the transnational corporation, and now I will come to this in a minute. Then we have, of course, something coming from the bottom up, trying to stimulate learning and innovation in order to close the gap in terms of capabilities between the workforce in the country and the multinational corporation. And then you have what I call strategic liberalization. Try to target the right sector when you can get in and exploit your advantages in a different way, and also to choose the partner, which I think it's a very important message I would like to convey in this presentation. When we talk about negotiation of the contract, we are thinking, and I'm thinking to one specific thing. One of the most important potential advantages coming from participation to global value chain and from foreign direct investment is the trickle down of the benefit going to local firm, which can source the multinational corporation, what we call local sourcing. Okay, there is a multinational corporation which is operating in your country. Probably the most important benefit from this is all the linkages that this multinational corporation is opening with other firms operating in the country, because these often entail transfer of technology apart from direct economic benefit for the firms. What is the problem? The problem is what in this very nice paper of a guy who's finishing his PhD here in Geneva in the Graduate Institute, which basically was showing how most multinational corporations operating in developing countries tend to, as we can define it, tend to be dependent on global sourcing policy. That is, they activated very little links with local enterprises. They prefer to source abroad. Okay, so what does lead to us to? Well, the idea is that what we should do as a government in a developing country is try to do whatever we can to maximize the local sources. And this you can do it in 2 ways. That's the usual way. You can play with the carrot and you can play with the stick. Or if you want to tell in another way, you can use push and pull mechanism. You can push, so using the stick, the multinational corporation to use local sourcing by having specific contracts on that. Okay, you can invest in other country, but you need to fulfill certain condition. But you can also use a more sort of carrot to do that. You can also pull and convince the firm to invest more in local sources. How you need to do that? That's a matter of investing in education and in creating the right capabilities in the countries in order to fulfill this kind of need. I have a nice paper with a friend of mine called Francesca Guadagno on the importance of the education, but unfortunately we have no time to discuss this, maybe another year. Another important dimension, which policy is important, is exploiting the potential advantages of services. Services are becoming more and more important. Okay, why this is the case? Well, tomorrow you will have my colleague Rashmi Banga will discuss about digitalization and the change that technology had on value chains. One of the things that the digitalization of the world economy is doing is somehow blurring the distinction between manufacturing and services. A lot of the value addition coming from manufacturing is now coming from services, but services related with manufacturing. You can think to whatever big digital corporation, a big tech companies getting a lot of value addition from the services rather than from the product. For knowing the markets and being able to design the product according to the needs of those markets. And in fact, when we look at data on services, you realize that in the last 10 years, the importance of services in global trade has been changed dramatically. And nowadays, if we look on data on trade in value addition, which are the data which tell us precisely where the value addition is coming for, almost the 50%, one half of the total value addition coming for export is related to the services sector more than to the primary or the manufacturing sector, precisely because much of the production and much of the benefit coming from the manufacturing sector are related with the services. So services are important and are becoming more and more important. What this implies in terms of policy making and in terms of development, Well, another very nice paper, this working paper which just came out a few months ago of a guy called Edmund, I guess, Lee. Well, what the guy is doing is trying to investigate the importance of regional trade agreements, which includes a chapter on services, on manufacturing, okay, on the unbundling on production, on the working of global value chains. And what he noticed is that liberalizing services has a positive impact not only on the services sector per se, but on the manufacturing sector, because it allows, it activates, in a sense, it facilitates it facilitates the opening of those links and the creation of those links, which are incredibly important when we talk about industrialization. But the most important result that he got is that services agreements between developing countries, that is South-South agreements, tend to have an impact on production and on the development of value chain in the developing country, which is much bigger than the impact that, for example, North-South agreement or North-North agreement has. Why this is the case? Because usually the bottlenecks that you have in between developing countries are much higher. The barriers to trade and the barriers to build together networks of production among developing countries are higher than among developed countries. So that's, again, this is pointing in the direction of this, what I call strategic liberalization. It is important to have this kind of agreement. It is much more important to do it in a South-South venue, right, rather than in a North-South venue, as it has been the case in the last 20, 25 years. Here, there is just one table. We'll be discussing some econometrics yesterday. That's basically what was the favorite specification of Lee. And in there, you have basically the impact of RTAs. But then, most important things that I wanted you to focus at is this yellow line, which is the interaction terms between the dummy variable, which tells me if some services agreement has been stipulated by the country, and the dummy variable, which tells me whether this agreement has been done on a South-South base, North-South base, or North-North base. And as you can see, this interaction term has positive and significant effect on the gross exports of the country, and even more important, on the intermediate goods exported by the country, on the backward linkages created, and on the forward linkages created with local enterprises. So having this kind of agreement at the South-South level has a direct impact on a lot of different components, which in the end accompany the process of industrialization, structural transformation, and economic development. Okay. The importance of South-South regional agreement leads me to the last part of this discussion, so I'm not going to go beyond my allocated time slot, which is the idea South-South is important, and in particular, when we think to South-South region are important. Okay, we've been discussing up to now global value chains, and what was the message of this presentation is that global value chains are potentially good because now we can take the benefit of trade just becoming able of undertaking one task along the global value chain. But the problem is that precisely because of our comparative advantage in terms of factor of production, developing countries remain trapped at very low value-adding tasks, so assembling and the production of basic components. So what we shall do, well, the natural thing that comes to my mind is look into regional value chain. What is a regional value chain? Is a value chain which takes place just in one region of the world. Is how Europe grew after the 50s. Marshall Plan was important, but the industrial story of Europe is a story of regional value chain. Later on, in the late 70s and the 80s, the Flying Geese, the industrial story of the Asian tiger is a regional industrial story. Now, Samsung, Toyota, these are all regional value chain, as Citroën and Nokia and Fiat, for example. So it's the importance of the region, which, of course, in the terms of the discussion that we had, emerged clearly. If the problem of global value chains, from the point of view of developing country, is the fact that the big part of the value chain, of the value addition, goes to other countries, these can be solved if we have the value chain at the regional level. Because at the regional level, by definition, the value addition remain at the level of the region. Africa, Asia, whatever you want to think at. Okay, and so regional value chains offers important opportunity to the country of a region to acquire value addition, but also, this learning by doing, to acquire those capabilities which are needed then to climb the ladder and to upgrade on global value chains. So you can think to this as a first step. I start with regional value chains, and then we move forward. Unfortunately, for as much as we would like to see more activity and more dynamics on regional value chains, nothing is happening. This is basically, I started this presentation showing you the change in foreign value addition taking place between 1995 and 2008. Here I'm doing the same thing, but I'm considering the regional component of the foreign value addition. Okay? And as you can see, basically, the data points remain where they are. These are the two regression lines for the 1995 and the 2008. So basically, the regression line overlap with the 45-degree lines, which is static. Okay, that's an electrocardiogram which is completely static. So there is no dynamics on that. So what we need to do and what we are doing, this is part of the work that, for example, we are doing with Southern African countries, trying to strengthen value chains. Well, I think there are 4 areas here are of particular importance when we think to accelerating the development of regional value chains and the building of regional value chains in different regions of the world. First of all, of course, we have removing barriers. There are all kinds of barriers. We have been discussing a few minutes ago the importance of services barriers, or agreement which liberalize the services in this case. Well, there are standards are as well extremely important. For example, when we think to developing countries, and particularly in some part of Western Asia and Africa, the agro-processing value chain is particularly important, what comes from, adding value from the primary, secondary agricultural sector. And here the difference in health standards and product specification can have important effect in creating and, creating problems and hurdles on the development of these regional value chains. One important issue is the lack of transparencies and asymmetries of information. We are working a lot with Southern Africa. One thing that it's incredible, is that South Africa, for example, is one of the world's biggest producer of poultry, okay, animal feed and poultry in particular. What you need to feed your chickens is soya beans, soya cakes, okay? Zambia happened to be one of the greatest world producers. Zambia just right up north from South Africa, but basically the 99% of soya cake that South Africa is importing to feed their chicken come from Argentina. Miles away, with a lot of cost in transports, precisely because they don't find a way to make the transport effective between Zambia and Southern Africa, not that much because you can think to infrastructure. No, it's not infrastructure in this case. It's, for example, the fact that usually when you have road transport, you need to fill in the truck on the way down and on the way up to make it economically viable, and you don't find these kind of ways to doing that. In particular, because you have a lot of asymmetries of information between companies, government, and different regions of the two countries. But it's an important loss of opportunity. We tend to think as economists that there are no such a thing as a free lunch. No? If you find $5 on the floor, there must be something wrong. Well, in this case, it's just a matter that we don't know. So just to fill this gap, I think, is incredibly important. Transport cost, of course, it's part of the story. Another thing is we sit around the table and we try to identify entry points into value chains and to coordinate our policy measures. For example, another potential very fruitful value chain in the region is the sugarcane value chain. But yes, I'm coming to the end. But the kind of trade policy which are implemented, for example, in this case, between Tanzania, Zambia, and Mozambique tend to be counteract. So it's a matter of really policy coordination, which is extremely important. Developing free industrial area, special economic zone is as well important. Rashmi probably will discuss with you something more in details on this, especially when we think to the development of industrial hubs and technological hubs, like you can think to Shenzhen in China. And then, of course, and I close with this, I think that fostering regional trade integration is extremely important. So facilitating the real development of regional agreements. Now in Africa, we are all speaking about the CFTA, the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which was ratified last year. 70% of countries of the region now ratified the agreement, but it's a matter of implementing really that agreement, which becomes more important than the agreement per se. I had some data on this for the tool that we use, the product space, just to give you an example of how effective regional integration can be, but I will leave this for next year's summer school, or if you're interested, just write me a mail. I will share with you our research. And in my last 5 seconds, just 3 points, which I want to stress, and I stress all along the presentation, but later we're saying repetita iuvant, so I repeated them once again. Global value chains could be potentially very important as a development tool, but participating to global value chain is not enough. As it is not enough, and Marius was discussing this point yesterday, attracting foreign direct investment. you need policy and you need a strategic vision. You need to think to the direction in which you are going, and I think from this point of view, being strategic, especially in choosing the right partners and looking to other developing economies and looking to developing economies in your region is of particular importance. Thank you very much.